Hello and welcome to TOI Books. Today we have with us international bestseller Emily Henry, who is known for writing her romances and young adult novels. More recently, the New York Times bestselling author, who's known for writing Beach Read and People We Meet on Vacation, is back with her new novel, Book Lovers. As the title suggests, the story is about two people who love books and reading, but they don't get well together, and but ultimately they do fall in love. Welcome to TOI Books, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me.
Emily, my first question is that you have written young adult novels and now you have switched to writing romances, and all three of them have are New York Times bestsellers. So, how easy was that switch for you, and what were the, if there were any challenges that you faced, what were they?
Yeah, so I think what drew me to writing the young adult novels in the first place was that I love those coming of age stories that focus on a time in a person's life when everything just feels so big and important. And also, you just feel like you're changing so much, your identity is changing, your understanding of how the world works and your place in it, and all of that just feels like there's just a ton of transformation happening in a teenager's life. And so that was why I liked writing those books. And when I wrote Beach Read, really, I wasn't at the time planning to try to publish it. I just was kind of struggling myself. And I felt like I needed to spend some time in a story that made me feel really good. It's just warm and happy. And so I started working on Beach Read for that reason. And I was really surprised when I was writing about these characters in their late 20s, early 30s to realize, that they were sort of going through their own coming of age and big transformation and readjustment to the world not being quite what they thought that it was. So at that point, I had set the book aside for a couple of years and then saw some authors doing quite well in the love story space. And I told my agent, like, oh, I actually wrote a book kind of like that and just didn't do anything with it. And so, once we took that out and sold it to publishers, and I started working on the follow-up, People We Meet on Vacation, which is also called You and Me on Vacation, depending on where it is. I just realized, oh, this is a coming of age story. It's about these two characters who are they are adults, but they still kind of feel lost and like they thought they would understand things a lot more clearly than they do by now. I think, when you're a kid, you kind of think once I'm an adult, everything will make sense and I'll just be who I am and that's who I'll be for the rest of my life. And that's not really what happens. It's like you're constantly changing and growing and realizing new things about yourself and, all of that. So I think that came somewhat naturally to me, the writing that kind of change because of my experience in the young adult space. But, there, of course, are challenges. Like I was writing into the romance genre and I had been writing sort of genre bending, sci-fi-ish, fantasy-ish novels before that. And I, found it hard at first to kind of come up with a plot that was just using real world things that everybody goes through, and I think the more books that I write, the more I'm like, okay, so how do I take these characters through this emotional arc but have it not be the same love story over and over and over again, because you're just working with what's real and what's around you. So that was kind of a challenge, but like I said, I loved the coming of age aspect, and realizing that I have the space to do that outside of writing about teenagers was really exciting. And knowing that, I will always be able to write those stories because our whole lives are just kind of a constant coming of age.
So, do you also feel related to any character when you're writing these books, and which
Yeah.
of them?
Yeah, I think I kind of relate to all of them, which as a writer, I think when I'm trying to get to know a character really well, I'll usually take one thing about myself, like whether it's a fear I have or a specific anxiety or anything like that. And I'll kind of build a character around that one trait. And so I think in a way I end up relating to everyone, but nobody is exactly me either. And so when I wrote Beach Read, like I said, I was kind of in a dark place emotionally and just really struggling. And January, the main character in that, is just a mess for the entire book. And she cries so much. And my editor even had to be like, we need to tone this back. Readers do not want to see this person cry for 300 pages. And she was totally right. But at the time, I just felt like this like raw nerve where everything, I was just so sensitive and so delicate and just in a really fragile state. And so that's kind of how she ended up being like that. And now when I look back on Beach Read, I don't relate to January all that much, but at the time I did. And with my newest book, Book Lovers, Nora, the main character, the female lead, I feel very different from her. She's, much more polished and put together, and this career woman as you picture her, like kind of the stereotype of a career woman. So we look very different, and I think we go about things very differently. But the one thing that I really connect with her on is that she deals with the things that go wrong in her life with humor. And that can be kind of jarring to people who don't deal with things that way, when they're like, I'm trying to have a serious conversation with you and you're just kind of finding the joke in it. But that was a little small detail that I enjoyed writing into her. That's, I think like coping with humor is a pretty common thing. And even with writing these romantic comedies, that was what I was doing. It was like, I'm struggling and I want to make something that will make me feel a little bit better, and that will hopefully make other people feel a little bit better who are struggling.
So Book Lovers is set in the publishing industry. Have you kind of tried to reflect upon the publishing industry or show the reality of the publishing industry in the book as well?
A little bit I have, because, you see the publishing industry, I feel like, in a lot of movies and TV shows, but it's always kind of changed. Yeah, it's not accurate. And it can be very fun, but I don't think that the average person realizes how much work actually goes into making a book. And the fact that, most editors are not making amazing money and they're working all day long. I'm sure it's the same in journalism. It's like, it's not a job that you just go home from and you're done. It's like your brain is kind of always working. And I thought that would be a fun glimpse for people. With Beach Read, I was writing about authors. And so people really enjoyed that and didn't really know how authors tend to work. And so with this one, I suspected that readers would like to know a little bit more of the process, behind the scenes. And even just things, a lot of the small details I was able to pull from my own experience. And I think the character of Nora, what I find so interesting about her is she is this really tough woman who is, able to negotiate in these intense situations to get the best contract for her clients. She's very tough, but she also works with authors who are famously neurotic messes, who need a lot of comforting and handholding and convincing that they're not the worst writer on the planet. And so I see this with my own agent, where I know she's very, very good at her job as far as negotiating with publishers, but on my side, she's very much a support system. And I think that's a really interesting job for someone to have, where they have to be so tough with half of the people they're interacting with, and then so tender with the other half.
Coming to writing and publishing, you have done a course in creative writing and not for an author. So, when was the first time you considered yourself to be an author?
Ooh, that's a very good question. No one's ever asked me that. I think it's been, I don't know if there was a hard line moment. Probably when I sold my first book, I thought, okay, now when I say that, I won't be lying. But I definitely remember for a few years after I finished my creative writing program, working really hard to mentally adjust to see myself as a real writer. And that meant, like, if I'm not going out with friends or not making it to a birthday party or anything like that because I'm working, I'm telling them I'm working, even though I'm not actually getting paid. It's like, I'm staying home to write. So I made this concerted effort to really start taking myself seriously before anyone else had. And I don't really know what drove me to do that, because it's kind of out of character. But I think even before I sold the first book, I was working really hard to just justify the time that I was putting into this thing that was not making any money as work, that I'm working on this. It's this long-term investment. And then I think, a couple years into publishing, I had to then adjust back the other direction and remind myself, I'm a person who writes. Writing is my job and I love it, but I do need to have a little bit of work-life balance and be present for the people in my life.
As a writer, I assume you're also an avid reader. Like a writer
Yes.
has to be a good reader. So, what
Yeah.
earliest memory of a book that has, that made a huge impact on you, or maybe that inspired you to become a writer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have always been a big reader, but I think that the first book, there's two books I always think of as I read them around the same time, and I didn't understand before that what books could do. And those two books were Madeline L'Engle's Wrinkle in Time and Lois Lowry's The Giver. And they're both sort of, genre bent fantasy dystopian books. They're all over the map as far as genre goes. But when I read The Giver, I remember there's this big twist partway through, and I was so surprised by it and so blown away. And it was the first time I had realized a book can change the way that you see the world. Because before that, it's like, I'm reading this book because I love this story, and then it's done and I want to read another one. I want to read another great story. But that was the first time I realized it could actually change you. And I was like 8 years old, and it blew my mind. And it really was the thing that first made me want to be a writer and not just a reader, to know that you could actually change the way that people were seeing the world.
Most, as you mentioned, that your stories are about, they're love stories, but they're also coming of age stories.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you also try to probably make a difference in somebody else's life through your writing? Is that the idea when you're writing a book?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, it's a lot of times it's what I need in that moment. It's the question I'm trying to answer, or the thing that I really need to hear. With Beach Read specifically, like I said, I was struggling, and I felt like I had always been sort of naive about the world and thought that it was a much nicer place than it really is. And it was the adjustment to accepting that, the world is messy and it can be very painful to be here. And so it was like adjusting to that and trying to find hope and joy and a sense of purpose in that. And so it was writing for what I needed at that time, trying to change the way that I see the world. And then once it, goes out, then it belongs to the readers. And I figure if it helps me in some small way, then hopefully it will help other people and bring them the kind of comfort that it brought me, or the just kind of the twist on the way that I've been thinking about something. It really always does start with me kind of needing to explore an idea and figure out how I really feel about it.
So does writing help you in, reflecting on your own life in a way?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's one of the greatest gifts of writing, really. It does feel like it's weird with fiction, because you're not actually writing about your own life. You're making up all of the details. You're writing about people who don't exist, but it really can do something for, not, some people are really nonfiction readers, and I'm not a huge nonfiction reader. I'll do some of that, but I think a fictional story can still somehow really transform you, and it can feel so true. It can feel like it's all made up. It's not real stuff, but it's a true story as far as the heart of it goes. And that, I think, is what made me fall in love with reading, was just the fact that you read this and it becomes a part of you, and it's like this new truth that you carry with you. So that's the feeling, I think, as a writer, that I'm always chasing, is like, I want to be changed by my work. I want to feel like I'm leaving a little bit better or stronger or kinder, whatever, than I started a book.
And as you mentioned, in Beach Reads, you were going through a tough time at that point, and that kind of reflected in your writing. So did writing Beach Read or writing any of your other books give you a perspective about your own life?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think Beach Read especially, I mean, I think a lot of my books always come back to the same point, where it's like a character is in pain in a very specific way, and they're trying to just figure out if the pain is like worth it. Basically, they're like, is the pain of love or forgiveness or just like life, is all of that, is there something that will make that worth it? And so much of my writing really is just getting to the point of remembering what's really beautiful and special about being alive. And I think specifically about love. Like, love is a terrifying gift to give, and it's a terrifying, to enter a relationship and to trust someone with your heart. Even a friendship like that can be so scary the more you let someone know you. And so I think all of my books, they just always come back to being reminded that that is also kind of the most important thing, in my opinion, about being alive, is just getting to really love and be loved.
Do you believe in the power of love, and that it can change the world in a way, or maybe change
I
people?
Yeah, I think it can change people on an individual basis, and that's what will change the world, is, the more that we let love into our hearts. I mean, that sounds so cheesy, but I'm writing romance novels for a reason. And I think it's like I think that one of the things I love about romance, specifically in love stories, is just the innate softness of that, and that it's honoring these very tender feelings and saying this is a story worth telling. And I like all kinds of genres. I don't just read romance, I read everything. But I think it's really special that there's this whole genre that's saying like love is a very important story. Like, that is something that needs a lot of time on the page, and it's okay for a whole book to just be about these two people finding their way to each other and working through what was keeping them apart. And yeah, I mean, I think that is a really powerful thing. It's like just it's what I think really does make life worth living, is the fact that you can know someone and get closer and closer and closer to them, and when these trials come up, you can find a way through it and be even closer for it.
As a romance writer, what would your relationship tips be for others?
Oh man. Oh gosh, I don't know if I've been asked this. I think it's, so much, I think too about romance. The good thing is I hear from a lot of readers who are like, oh, great, you ruined me for my standards. They're way too high now. But I think that's a good thing. It's like, you want your standards to be high, because you shouldn't be with anyone who makes your life noticeably worse. It's like, if you should like your life and have someone who makes it somehow even better. So I think the not settling thing, I know that's like a really hard thing, because you can't control who's around you and how they treat you and all of that. But then also I think respect is just so important. And that's a common thread. I'm writing characters a lot of times who start out sort of as enemies, but I try to never let that dislike of each other or the way that they kind of grate on each other become outright disrespect, where they're treating each other like they're stupid or like calling each other names or anything. I think respect is really important, because feelings fluctuate on a day-to-day basis, but you want to be with someone who will really treat you like the valuable human that you are.
Right. Um, Talking about romance novels, so which are your favorite romance novels of all time?
One that I always go back to that really is a true, like, it's a historical romance novel. It's called Luckiest Lady in London by Sherry Thomas. And it is so angsty and just beautifully written. And I've probably read it 4 times in the last 2 years. So I'm not even a huge rereader, but I go back to that one a lot. Christina Lauren, I love all of their books, but especially Josh and Hazel's Guide to Not Dating, I think is so, so, so fun. I'm trying to think what else is on my shelf. I'm not at home right now, so I have to like look around and try and envision my books. Those are 2 that come to mind right away. Talia Hibbert's Get a Life, Chloe Brown is another really good one that I think it balances that sweetness and fun with some heavier life topics, which I really love. That's one of my favorite things in a romance, is when it kind of feels like real life, but then better than real life, because there's this lovely romance in it. Those are the first 3 that come to mind. I'm sure I'm missing so many, but I would highly recommend all 3 of those.
You mentioned earlier that you have written science fiction and
Mhm.
obviously written young adult novels and romances. So, is there any other genre that you would like to experiment?
I would. I honestly want to write everything. I would love to write a thriller at some point, and I would love to write a horror at some point. But right now, because this is what people are excited about, I want to make sure I'm honoring the readers who have, given me this career. So someday I will try to expand into other genres as well, but I am going to try and keep doing this as long as it is fun for everyone, including me.
Also, becoming a best-selling author, does it put a kind of pressure on you when you're writing
Yeah.
the next book? Obviously, the end.
Yeah, it does. It maybe it shouldn't, but it does, because I really do appreciate what people have given me in this career, in this life. Like it really means a lot to have people love your books like that. And I really want the readers who have supported me to be happy with the books that I put out. I really want them to feel like they're waiting a whole year or longer for the next book every time. So I really want them to feel like they're getting what they've been waiting for. Um, but I try and shut that out while I'm writing, because I don't think it's super helpful while you're writing to just be imagining, well, people like this. I think it's better to just be true to the story. And then when you're revising, really just take every book to the furthest point you can get it and make it as good as you possibly can. But yeah, there's definitely some pressure.
So, how do you deal with it?
Not
Writing again,
well.
that there are people waiting to read books.
I really, I don't deal with it gracefully. I'll tell you that. I with book lovers, and then with the book that I can't say too much about, but I'm working on another book, with both that last one and this one, I spend so much time just kind of spiraling with the doubt, like, is this good enough? Is this funny enough? And I just try and remind myself that all I can do is look at a page at a time. And I think making a book is such a big, weird experiment where it's hard to even imagine how, having done it, it's hard to imagine how it gets made, because it's just so big. And so when I'm working, I really have to kind of home in on the individual sentence or page that I'm looking at and try and make excuse me, that the best thing it can be. And that, I mean, there's not, I haven't figured out a magical trick to get past that self-doubt yet, so I just do it anyway.
And I think self-doubt is something that every writer goes through.
Yeah. I mean, that's I don't know anyone really who doesn't have that, unfortunately. So I think that's comforting for people who are aspiring writers who haven't published yet. It's so easy to think, well, this would be easier if I were a real writer, then I wouldn't be feeling this way. And unfortunately, I think all writers feel that way.
So, are there any tips that you would like to share for any aspiring writers out there?
Yeah. I think the big thing for me is I always tell people who have trouble finishing projects to start by just writing a really bad first draft and finishing it no matter what, because there's so much freedom and power in just knowing you can finish a whole book. It feels so insurmountable before you do it. And then even if it's horrible, which all of my first drafts are, if you can write to the words at the end, then you know you can do it again. And you know you have this whole book and you can fix it no matter how bad it is. So I think for me, the key really has been letting go of that perfectionism in the first draft and just accepting that the book will probably be horrible at first, and that's okay. And that's very freeing too.
Hmm. Uh, would you like to tell us a bit more about the next book that you're working on?
I will tell a tiny bit. I don't know when we're going to be announcing it formally, so there's not a ton that I can say, but it is another rom-com. It's also very summery, as all of my books have been so far. Will hopefully come out next summer. And there is a little bit of kind of the fake dating trope mixed in there, which I think a lot of romance readers will be excited about. I certainly love it as a reader.
Uh, could you please describe your a day in your life as a writer?
Yeah, sure. I really do. I'm very, very, very fortunate to be able to write full time at this time anyway. And so I really do wake up, I get myself a cup of coffee, and I sit down. I might play like Wordle or a couple of little word games on my computer. And then I will pretty much immediately start writing. So if I'm drafting like the first draft of a book, I will write 2,000 words a day, no matter what, unless, if there's an emergency, sometimes there's an emergency, but my goal is 2,000 words a day until a book is done. And so that usually means the first draft takes like a month and a half, and it's very, very, very bad at that point. And I set it aside for a couple of days, and then I turn to the editing phase where it's like I'll get up in the morning, same thing, have a cup of coffee, and then I'll make a list. I'll start making a list of everything I already know needs to change, and then I'll kind of read through it and be making the changes I already know I need to make, but I'll also be gathering information for a next pass. And I really do pretty much work, like a full work day on my computer. And sometimes I get a ton done, and sometimes I end up working till 8 at night and I have just barely made my word count goal. But I really do subscribe to the idea of just sitting down and doing it, no matter how bad it is, and just believing you can fix it later.
And lastly, have you been to India?
I haven't, and I would love to. So hopefully that will be in the future.
All right. Thank you so much, Emily, for your time. It was lovely talking to you.
It was so great. Thank you so much for having me.